it is the policy and practice of the Australian Government to intercept any vessel that is seeking to illegally enter Australia and safely remove it beyond our waters. If you travel by boat without a visa, you will not make Australia home. The rules apply to everyone: families, children, unaccompanied children, educated and skilled. There are no exceptions. Do not believe the lies of people smugglers. These criminals will steal your money and place your life and the life of your family at risk for nothing. The message is simple. If you come to Australia illegally by boat, there is no way you will ever make Australia home.
In 2013, Australia's government announced a tough new policy towards refugees travelling by boat to its shores. The campaign that went with it was called No Way You Will Not Make Australia Home. Its goal was to discourage asylum seekers from entering the country as the government saw it illegally. Most were coming from a handful of countries including Somalia, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Myanmar. However, many migrants, having fled their homes, considered themselves stateless. Their journeys were elaborate. Those from Iran, for example, would travel first to Malaysia, where they could enter without a visa. Then they'd make their way to southernmost Indonesia, and from there they took boats towards Australia's closest island. The trips were not simple. They typically involved smugglers and dangerous, sometimes deadly journeys on boats that were often overloaded and unseaworthy. Of the boats intercepted at sea by Australia's border force, many were forcibly turned back to where they'd come from. But passengers on some, and all those who did make it into Australian waters, were taken into custody, then deported, flown to neighbouring countries. There, in Nauru and on Papua New Guinea's Manus Island, they are still held in what Australia's government calls regional processing centres. They are, perhaps more accurately, prisons. Nauru is a tiny 29 square kilometre island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That small independent country, a member of the United Nations, has played a central role in the history of Australia's refugee policies. Nauru's detention centre first opened in 2001 under a policy brought in by Australia's Conservative Liberal Party, the so-called Pacific Solution. But this all changed when Kevin Rudd from the centre-left Labour Party came to power in 2007. Rudd closed Nauru's centre and most of the refugees were relocated to Australia. But then, as the number of asylum seekers arriving in Australia by boat started going back up, the Labour Party's government was forced to reconsider. The prison reopened in 2012. Today, the island's detention centre is home to almost 500 people, including about 50 children. Many of them have been there for more than 3 years. But what's going on inside? Both the Nauruan and the Papua New Guinean prisons are run under a veil of secrecy, off limits to the media and to NGOs like Amnesty International. People working there are not allowed to talk about what they have seen. Why? This week, Talk to Al Jazeera sits down with former employees who have decided to break their silence to tell us about the situation inside Australia's prison camps. Are they, as the government says, having the desired effect by discouraging people from making dangerous journeys? But are they also, as the people we spoke to say, dehumanizing and dangerous? Evan Davis is a teacher who used to work with children living in the Australian-run camp in Nauru. Despite secrecy provisions limiting the ability of staff to talk, he has decided to share his experience.
My first impressions of Nauru was I couldn't believe how poor the civil works were, the infrastructure of the island, the state of the repairs of the buildings, and in particular the asbestos roofs that were just untreated and flapping in the wind. The cars that had been broken down and were just left on the side of the road or in people's houses, and also the large dogs that were roaming the streets. Those were the impressions that struck me first. The island, its infrastructure, despite the millions and millions or tens of millions of dollars that are going into that country, the civil infrastructure was just appallingly bad. I've been in countries, Jakarta, Manila, Bangkok, large Southeast Asian cities where there is a huge amount of poverty, and yet those places are much, much better looked after than what I saw in Nauru. We arrived at the camp, which to my surprise was in the middle of the island, so it was away from the sea breezes and what I considered to be quite a scenic view of the ocean. I was surprised to see that. The first thing that struck me was as we arrived in the camp, I was a new arrival, so the guards got onto the bus and basically said, right, everybody that's new, off for here. And they took us into an office and gave us temporary IDs. But it struck me straight away that the place was more like a military camp, a prison more than anything else, that was quite efficiently run.
Because you've been told, as most Australians are, that it's a regional processing centre, that people are there just for a set amount of time. Yes, they are living within a compound, but it's not one with barbed wire fences or guards with guns. The government says it's definitely not militarised at all. But was that your impression? Oh
no, I think that's... There was no arms. No one was carrying a sidearm, or I never saw any long arms being carried. But I certainly got the impression that this was a compound that was a secure compound, a prison, as opposed to just a processing centre. It was definitely run, high security. There was guards everywhere. That was the overwhelming thing that surprised me, is just how many personnel there were in the security side of things. There were guards everywhere. Everywhere you looked, there was a guard. I don't think you could have stood in the camp anywhere, and this is in RPC 1, where the school was located, the administration offices, that even that camp felt like it was a prison.
And that gives the impression that this is more of an Australian thing than a Nauruan thing. I mean, if you believe the government here, they'll tell you time and time again that anything to do with that camp is really up to Nauru.
Oh no, not at all. The place was well and truly run by the Australians. There was no question about that whatsoever. My first impression there of Nauruan influence was actually nil. I didn't see anybody. I just basically saw security staff, Wilson's, some immigration staff, and Save the Children staff. We stood out because we had to wear red shirts. I mean, everybody had to wear their clothing which identified them. So the construct guys, for example, the construction guys had their high vis on. Wilson had their khaki clothes on. Immigration had the navy blue, and we had red.
Tell me about some of the things that you saw there. Some of the things that shocked you. What sorts of things did you witness?
The next thing that really that came to be a shock, and I thought that it was unnecessary, and later on we obviously realised that it was designed to cause fatigue and wear people out, was the fact that the camps weren't placed near each other. Camp number 1, where the school was, and the IHMS administration, MS, and our accommodation, was basically at the other end of the island. Even though it was a small island, we had to go by dirt road to go and get the kids in the morning. So my first morning on the 22-seater coaster bus from RPC 1 was a bumpy ride along a dirt road, dusty. Most of the time the buses were air-conditioned, but it was still uncomfortable. And it took about 20-25 minutes just to get there, just a relatively short trip in length, but quite a long time to get there. And again, once we got to that camp, I was surprised that it was built, it looked like it was built in an old quarry, because the camp, you had the accommodation was down in a gully, it was down in a recess, it was like a big crater. So when we first got to the camp, same thing again, we had our identification on us. There was myself and a couple of other teachers. Onto the bus, there was 2 security staff waiting at the gate. On the bus gets one of the security staff and he scans our ID, then gets off and we proceed, and then we pick up the kids. The kids were waiting for us at the bus stop. This was on my first occasion I was there. And then the kids had to go through the rigmarole. They had to be scanned, they had to show their ID. And we then had to fill in the paperwork which identified their kids, not through their name, but by a number. It was an alphanumeric number. It was three numbers, then 3 digits. And that's how the kids were referred to. What we endeavoured to do is learn their names by rote, off by heart, so we didn't have to ask their numbers. We could just write it down as soon as we saw the kid, and we could identify them as what we can talk to them using their names.
So just to be absolutely clear, this is children being referred to by numbers rather than names?
Yeah, what's your number? There would be a 5-year-old kid and a guard would say, what's your number? And the kid would recite the 6-digit number, it was alphanumeric, so there was 3 letters and then 3 numbers. So for example, ABC 1, 2, 3. And the ABC with the boat that they came on, so the first one was what they called the boat number. So the three letters would be the boat identifier. I don't understand how it was allocated, but everybody that came on the same boat had the same first 3 letters. Say for example, if everybody was on the same boat and it was boat ABC, then the first person that was processed, I assume, would have been ABC 001, and the second person ABC 002, and so forth. So that's how they were identified.
It's pretty dehumanising, isn't it?
Well, it's the whole process. I mean, this is part of the process that the whole camp was set up like that. And again, we arrived at these camps.
Sorry, set up like what?
Set up to break their spirit, to dehumanise people, to grind them into the ground, and I assume to encourage them to go back. But also, I'm quite sure that was, well, in fact, I know it was done to prevent other people from trying to get to Australia as well, because what they were basically doing is that if you come to Australia, this is how you're going to be treated. And that word got out, and by various means, government programs and that sort of thing. So yeah, the whole thing was set up. The whole camps were set up to break people's spirits, to cause trauma, and that's probably one of the most distressing things that I first realised, and that is that, I'm an Australian. I'm from a liberal democratic country where our rights are enshrined and personal freedoms and all those sort of things are held in. They're covered by law. They're protected by law. We consider that those things are really, really important. In fact, paramount. And yet, the people in Nauru, the refugees and the asylum seekers in Nauru, they were completely deprived of those things, and deliberately so.
Judith Ream also used to teach secondary school kids on Nauru. She is a descendant of Bosnian refugees herself, which is one of the reasons she decided to speak publicly.
The conditions were shocking in all of the compounds. There were marquee tents, so those tents were not designed for habitation, they were designed for events and for catering. So there was a recreation area where they could pray and we could give lessons, and that was a shared space. That was really, I often felt like it was a little bit disrespectful to them when I was trying to give a lesson and they were trying to pray. And there was a female in the room, and all these things, these cultural considerations weren't really taken into account properly. But it was we just did the best with what we had, and they were in shared accommodation, and you could see that there would be 20 people in a room. And then Foxtrot was again different. So that was, there were World War II bunkers in Foxtrot. That I taught in one of those, and I would literally walk out drenched in sweat. You'd lean over and drip on their work. It was just really, you'd feel quite lightheaded when you walked out, because if it was 35, it was 40 in there. So that was, and you could see that there's a famous compound from Foxtrot where there were literally like 40 to 50 men, and you could smell it when you walked past. And when it rained on Manus, the sewage would just rise up. There just weren't, it was, you could see raw sewage running through Foxtrot. It was really disgusting.
Judith Ream feels particularly bad about having prepared the children for a life in Australia that was never going to happen.
Like, I feel that in retrospect, I was a part of the lie, because I was teaching them conversational English for life in Australia, and that just hasn't happened. It felt a lot worse than a prison, a lot worse, because there's, they didn't have access to proper study. We couldn't certify them at the end of their HSC. We couldn't provide them with pathways to future education, and in fact there's no university obviously on Nauru. So we couldn't, at that time we didn't have any IELTS exams. We just did practice tests with them.
And the mental trauma they were going through, particularly the kids. I mean, tough being there in limbo for that length of time, was it?
Yeah, and it makes me cross when a news agency like A Current Affair go there and say, well, look, this is how it is. How do you capture on film what it's like to have your life suspended for 3 years? Or how empty the days are, or how, some of the children in the camp can't remember life before the camp, because they were so little when they arrived, and some of them arrived when they were 14 and their entire adolescent years have passed in a camp.
Are you doing this talking out because you feel a duty to play witness to what you saw?
We saw the inside of those camps, and they have been deliberately concealed and kept, you know, in this clandestine place and away from the public eye. I'm just so ashamed that this is how Australia is behaving in the world's largest refugee crisis. I just think that we're a different country. This is not who we are. This is not what Australians think of themselves. We believe that we're good people and that we care for the vulnerable and the sick and that we give everyone a fair go. We're not a nation that tortures people. We don't lock people up for 3 years, especially not children. And I think that if Australians could look into those camps and see how people are suffering and who they really are, if they knew that they were just human beings like you and I, you know, this would be very different. This would be very different. The cloak of secrecy around it is what allows us, you know, this plausible deniability, which is, you know, hopefully a luxury I can take away. You know, something, I just want to say, this is real. Those IRs are real. This is really happening and we have to stop it now. Don't turn around in 10 years and say you didn't know.
Jennifer Rose, another elementary school teacher in Nauru, believes Australia needs to take a different approach when it comes to dealing with asylum seekers.
Anything we witnessed, we had to report. It was part of our contractual obligation. So it could be a fight between children, it could be inappropriate behaviour between a service provider and a client. It could be a disclosure of self-harm, or all sorts of things. Children talking about something that had happened in their tent that night. And so we witness these regularly. I was recently going through the Guardian website and I found 2 that I think I had written, and that was just looking in the first 3 months. So you can imagine over 2 years, there's probably quite a few in there that I've written. I just think we can do better. I think, I'm not saying open the borders, I'm not saying let every boat in, I'm not saying let everybody come here. What I'm saying is there needs to be a fair system. They've been proven to be refugees. We need to end this now. We need to let these people rebuild their lives. We need to do it in a fair and compassionate way. And we haven't stopped the boats. We're stopping boats at sea. So this policy hasn't worked at stopping the boats. We know that. And yes, I'm very close to it, but I feel like I have a duty to speak out. I feel that we'll look back at history of this and we'll say, what did we do? And I think some people will try and say, oh, we didn't know, but we do know. I am very close to this issue, but how could you not be affected? How could you not be affected by seeing children re-traumatised by a system that Australia has set up?
I know what you hope. You hope that Nauru will be closed and people brought to Australia, likewise Manus. What do you fear?
I fear that they'll be left there for much longer. I think it's critical. I just think there's got to be a better solution. We have to be able to do better than this. We have to be able to develop better policies, whether it's they go to another country, that's a possible option, but just leaving people there as a deterrent, I believe is very unfair. I believe that our country believes in giving people a fair go, and that's not what we're doing. And we're talking about children here, children who've had no role in making this decision. We need to do better.
Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott was instrumental in formulating the country's current immigration policy. In an interview for Australian television, he was adamant that Nauru and the policy to deny refugees access to his country is saving lives.
There were almost 2,000 children in detention in the middle of 2013 under the former government's watch. There were almost 1,400 children in detention at the time of the election. That number is now under 200. Why? Because this government has stopped the boats. Now, I have a very simple question. Where was the Human Rights Commission during the life of the former government when hundreds of people were drowning at sea? Where was the Human Rights Commission when hundreds of people were drowning at sea? Where was the Human Rights Commission when there were almost 2,000 children in detention? Now, frankly, Neil, this is a blatantly partisan, politicised exercise, and the Human Rights Commission ought to be ashamed of itself.
Do you want those 200 kids out of detention?
Of course, but the best way to ensure, the only way to ensure that we have no children in immigration detention is not to have any boats. And those boats have stopped thanks to the strong but necessary policies of this government, and I reckon that the Human Rights Commission ought to be sending a note of congratulations to Scott Morrison saying, well done, mate, because your actions have been very good for the human rights and the human flourishing of thousands of people.
But Evan Davis says no congratulations are in order. In fact, he says he was warned by doctors that working on the island for more than 3 weeks in a row could be damaging to his mental health.
On one occasion, I asked to do a 4-week rotation as opposed to a 3-week rotation, which after a bit of convincing they agreed to. I said, look, you know, I cope with this environment reasonably well. I don't think I'll have any problems, and then they finally agreed to it. After I did that, I then asked for a 5-week rotation so I could resync my time off with my son's holidays time so we could have Christmas together, or at least January off together. And they said no. They said, look, you can't have 5 weeks. And when I asked why, they said because it's no good or it's detrimental to your psychological health. Our medical experts, our medical specialists advise us that anything more than 4 weeks is not acceptable, and the risk to your mental health is too much. We consider 3 weeks to be optimal, but anything more than that is detrimental to workers' mental health. So of course, when we extrapolate that, when we think about that further, is that for someone like me whose future is known, and the fact that I'm housed in air-conditioned room and my conditions are quite good, and I know my future, I know that in a certain day I'll be out of here and I'll be back home having a holiday and enjoying my respite time. So my future is certain, and I understand. So how can that possibly be detrimental to my health, being out there for 5 weeks when they expect a little kid, 5 years old, they're to be there for 3 years? It's just a tacit, it's just a clear recognition that that environment is very detrimental.
Immigration has been a long-running public policy issue in Australia. In 2007, then Prime Minister John Howard laid down principles for immigration policies which are still frequently echoed.
It's about this nation saying to the world, we are a generous, open-hearted people, taking more refugees on a per capita basis than any nation except Canada. We have a proud record of welcoming people from 140 different nations. But we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
What's your understanding of the laws that prevent you speaking up, and why are you speaking up?
The reason why I'm speaking out is because what I saw and what I experienced I thought was just absolutely appalling. I couldn't believe that we as a country, Australia, is doing this to people. I mean, it's just, we're basically bullying these people, we're just torturing them, and I was just absolutely ashamed that our country is doing this. And then when we report this back on the news that it's okay, or the minister at the time, Minister of Immigration, would say, oh no, those reports aren't true, when we knew that they were absolutely true. So for us to speak out, it's not a right, it's an obligation. We have to do it. In terms of the laws belong in the last century, they belong in Stasi Germany. I mean, it's just ridiculous to say that people such as myself can't speak about these things when they see horrors that are going on. That we'll look back on this time with shame. We'll look back on this time dismayed that our government has lied to us, and we've done this to people.
This programme has reached out to the Government of Australia to ask its Immigration Minister to answer questions about his country's policies. Next week, Peter Dutton talks to Al Jazeera.